We are going to be paper piecing or foundation piecing 4 trees and a silo this month. So there's a lot of pieces of fabric in your kit. So let me go over what goes to what. So the first block on your list is a short pine tree. And the tree trunk is brown, and then it has 3 greens in it and a background that's 8 by 10. So all the trees except for the triangle tree are going to be made out of the 14 green strips here. They're all the same size, so you can use whichever one you want, wherever you want on those trees. And then the tree trunks, you have 4 browns. Again, they are all the same size, so you can use them on whichever tree you want. The background for the short pine tree, the first one on your list, is this aqua that has polka dots in it. So it's aqua with the white polka dots. The next thing on the list is the silo. This long brown strip and the small red rectangle are for the silo and the roof. And then the smallest aqua or bluish square is the background on that one. That is actually the same fabric as this one over here, but the small one is for the silo. Then for the triangle tree, again, you're going to get your trunk out of one of these browns, but your biggest piece of green is for the triangle tree. And then for the background, the piece that has the swirls in it, that's the background for the triangle tree. Now you could probably switch some of these out a little bit, or you could make it scrappy, but this is what I intended when I made the kit. Then the tall pine tree, the browns and the greens we've already talked about. Your background is the big piece of marble, and it is also the filler strip that's listed on there. So you're going to be getting both out of that piece. And then finally, browns and greens again on the woven tree, and your background for that one is the crackle. These are the patterns for our foundations for this month. I would very strongly recommend that you not sew on these pieces of paper. There's a couple reasons. One, this pattern that you're getting each month retails for $25, so I personally would like to keep it in case I ever want to use any of it again. Also, if you made a mistake while you were sewing through these, you don't have the pattern to go back to. So I would recommend that you copy these. You can take them to a copy store, or you can just copy them on a home copier. And I would recommend that you copy them onto foundation paper. I know there's a glare there. There are different brands. This one happens to be Carol Doak's. This one is kind of like newsprint. It's easier to tear away when we get ready to tear it away. It's not slippery, so your fabric doesn't slip off of it. And it's not going to smear. It absorbs the ink. Now, if you absolutely don't have the foundation paper and don't want to invest in it, although I do recommend it, you could do it on copier paper. It's just going to be harder to tear away and maybe a little bit harder to see through, but just know those are options. The other thing that's really nice to have, it's not absolutely necessary, is add a quarter ruler. These rulers, if you look at them this way, you might be able to see it. There's a lip right here. Same thing on this one. These are 2 different kinds. This is the original one, and this is the Add a Quarter Plus. It has a beveled edge as well that you can fold back on, and I'll show you that. These are not absolutely necessary, but they're really nice to have if you are doing paper piecing. These are the 6-inch ones. They also come in 12 inches. For what we're doing here, the 6 is probably fine, but if you only have a 12, that will work too. So we're ready to get started. We have copied our foundation onto a different piece of paper, preferably foundation paper, and I'm going to cut out whichever one I'm going to start with. For the video, I am only going to foundation piece one of these blocks. The process is exactly the same no matter what you're piecing. You're always going to start with number 1, add number 2, and so on and so forth. I'm going to demo on the tall pine tree. 1, because it's the only one that has a filler strip to add to it, and 2, because there's a lot of pieces, although I may not show all of them on camera, but it gives us enough time that hopefully you will have the concept. So before I start doing anything else with this background, I'm going to cut a 2-inch strip off of it so that I have it for my filler piece later. I'm not going to worry about clean cutting The edges are going to be short right now because I'll be cutting it down in length, but I just want to set it aside so I don't cut it up. And I wavered there, but I wavered the right direction so I can still square it up. Anyway, I'm going to set it aside so that I still have it when I get done piecing my tree. In some of her later patterns, she had you pre-cut some pieces to make it easier to foundation piece. She didn't on this one, but I think it's easier to handle. So I'm going to look at this. My number 1 piece, I'm just going to use my brown right there on it. But number 2, number 3, I need to make sure I have 1/4 inch beyond my stitching line, so the solid lines are my stitching lines. I also need to make sure that I'm going to have at least 1/4 inch outside those for where I'm going to be trimming the block up. So let's see. I think I'm going to trim another 2-inch strip because I can use that. Probably use that. Let's go 2.5 just to be sure. So I'm going to cut a 2.5-inch strip off of here to work with rather than the whole big piece. You don't have to do this. Again, this is an optional step, but I think it will make my life easier. So now I'm ready to start foundation piecing. I'm going to take my pattern, and this is the side I'm going to sew on, so all of my fabric is going to be put on this side. So life will be easier if you fold all these creases, because then you can see where they are on the other side before you start. So I can use my add 1/4 plus, just put it on the line and fold. Just put a crease in. Do it here and fold. Now I'm off a little bit, but not the end of the world. I haven't committed to anything there. Then I'm going to fold. Now, if you don't have the add 1/4 plus, you can actually just use a piece of junk mail, so like a brochure weight, or you could use an index card to fold back on. Just something to set there on the crease or on the line to help you fold it somewhat accurately. Fold there. So then I just get this folded up piece of paper. So I think you get the idea. I'm not going to finish doing all of this on camera. I'll come back and do it later. First thing I need to do is get my number 1 piece on here, and it's going to go on the back side, and I can see where my folds are. And I'm just going, for every single number 1 piece, the wrong side of the fabric is against the paper on the plain side, not the line side. So I could either put a pin in that to hold it, or I could use just a little bit of glue. I'm using a Sew-Line glue stick, a glue stick from the office supply store would work too. It's not something we want to stay there forever. We just want it to hold that temporarily. Yep, it's going to hold. So I'm going to come back. The next piece I'm going to be adding is number 2. So I would like to know where my seam is so that I can position my next piece easily. What I can do, if I'm using my add 1/4 plus, I just put it on that line and fold back. Then I bring it, and the lip side, I flip over so that it's catching on the paper right there. And then I just cut off the extra. Okay, so I know that I need to match my next piece up right there with that. Now, I also have this extending beyond up here, so if I want to be able to see exactly where I need to go, I can flip it over again, and this time let me show you with not the add 1/4 plus. If you just have the old style of add 1/4, and they do still make them, you can use a index card, put it on the line that's going to be the stitching line eventually, and fold back over the index card. In this case, you can just leave it there. The add 1/4, the regular one, again has the lip. My lip goes down over that, and I cut my seam allowance. That way I can see where my end is up there on the top. On the bottom, I can see where the paper's ending. I'll extend a little bit beyond that. So now I can take that 2.5 inch strip, I don't remember what I cut now, I can put it right sides together with that cut edge, and I'm going to want to check it, so fold it back at about 1/4 and it's covering. If it doesn't cover, so say I was back here and I folded it back, that's still covering. I'll say the seam was here and I'm covering. I don't have my seam allowance. I can see my line through here, so if you need to, you can hold it up to the light, but I can see that this, when I fold it out, is going to cover my raw edges. So I'm going to go ahead and put a couple pins in this. And I do the pinning. You don't have to, but I do the pinning because it tends to want to flip up when I go to the sewing machine. So I'm actually pinning from the paper or from the line side so that I can see to remove them when I get to them. Okay, so I'm going to show you the sewing this time. I don't do that very often. But when I go to the sewing machine, I am going to shorten my stitch length. I'll probably go about 1.5 on my sewing machine. Some people say you don't need to do that anymore, but what it helps with is it perforates the paper so that it's easier to tear away when we're ready to remove the pattern. It also, with a shorter stitch length, is less likely to pull out when I am tearing the paper away. When I go to sew, what I want is this line to this line, but I'm going to start and end about 1/4 inch before that line starts and end about 1/4 inch after. I like using an open toe foot when I'm paper piecing. You don't have to do that, you just need to be able to see the line. So I have shortened my stitch length to 1.5, and I think I'm going to put my needle down function on. And then I just need to stitch on that line. So I started 1/4 inch before that line started. I'm going to pull my pin. I'm a little off because I'm sitting a little weird from the sewing machine so you can see. And then I'm going to sew 1/4 inch about off the end after I get to that line. Here's the back side where the fabric is sewn together, and it'll save you a lot of time if you can have a pressing and cutting surface right next to your sewing machine. So you can see here my seam allowance got a little bit bigger than 1/4 inch. I can trim that down. I'm going to first though look at it, and I want to make sure that I'm going to have at least 1/4 inch beyond down here, and it doesn't have to be exact yet because I am going to trim this down later. So I'm going to just cut that piece off. Then I can come back over to this side and look, and I am going to go ahead and trim that down. I just fold back on my stitching line, put my add 1/4 down, and trim. If it's not a dark showing through a light, that's probably not absolutely necessary. So now I'm ready to press my blue background piece into place. So I'm just going to swing the camera over to the pressing surface. And just like when I piece anything else, I like to press as sewn first, so just press that seam in place. Then the piece that I just added, I'm going to flip it over the seam allowance and press it in place. Okay, so now I'm ready to add piece number 3. I'm going to follow the same process as I did before. But this time let me show you what to do if you don't have an add 1/4 ruler and don't want to invest in one. I'm going to fold on the line between 1 and 3 because I'm going to be adding 3 next, and this line is the one I'm going to be stitching. So I'm going to just fold back on that line using my index card or a piece of junk mail. Fold. And if I don't have the add 1/4, I can use a regular ruler and just line up my 1/4 inch mark with that fold. The add 1/4 is a little easier because it grips onto the edge, but this will work too. And cut. So now I have my seam allowance. So again, I'm going to flip it over. It's still my background fabric, so I can take my piece. I know as long as it comes up to here and down to here, I'm going to have my 1/4 inch seam. I can double check, folding it at about 1/4 inch. And yes, it is going to cover. So again, I'm going to pin it in place, and again I like to do it from the paper side so that I can see to pull them out. You are welcome to try this without pinning. It's just when it gets flipped up and I'm stitching with that short stitch length, it's no fun to tear out the stitches. So it's pinned, and I'm now ready to sew this line on this line just like I did the last one. So I'll show you that again at the sewing machine, and then I'll probably, sorry you can't even see that, this line. Then I will probably sew without bouncing back and forth every time. Once again, I'm starting about 1/4 of an inch before my line actually starts. I'm using my needle down function just because that makes it easier for me to. And I'm going to sew all the way to the end. And that's a good idea to pull the pins as you get to them, but I didn't. All the way to the end, and then about 1/4 of an inch off the end. And that seems sewn. Again, I ended up with just a little bit more than 1/4 of an inch here, so I'm going to fold it back. I'm going to cut. And then I'm going to go ahead and use my add 1/4 plus from here on out, but I did show you how you can do both ways using just the regular add 1/4 and an index card or piece of junk mail, or just a regular ruler. It's just much easier to have that lip writing along the edge of the paper when you're foundation piecing. So I trimmed off my excess there. Now I'm going to flip it to this side, and I'm going to flip open and press again. Know that you need to see me press every time, but I'll show you this one last time. Press it as sewn, and then flip it out and press. So we've added pieces 1, 2, and 3. So the next one we're adding is number 4. So again, I want to trim and have that 1/4 inch seam allowance there to make my life easier. I'm going to put whatever guide I'm using on the seam between the 1, 2, 3, and 4, because that's the next one we're going to be adding, and fold back on that. So those little stitches that were 1/4 inch before, just rip them out of the paper so that you can fold it back. Fold. Then I'm going to put my lip down and cut my 1/4 inch seam. Okay, so this is the next piece I'm adding. So I just need to pick one of my greens. And I've sorted mine out and decided which tree I want it to go on. So this one's going to go here. I'm going to fold it right sides together. So always, except for the first piece, the fabric goes right sides together. So you should be seeing the wrong side. Your first piece, the wrong side gets attached to your foundation paper. So all I need to do is line up my straight edge with that straight edge I just cut from my seam allowance. This is extending beyond on both sides. I could double check. I know it's going to be big enough because I cut all your pieces plenty big enough. But if you were using up scraps, it would be a good idea to double check. I'm going to put a couple pins in, and if pinning from the paper side is a pain, you could always put pins in from the fabric side and then flip it over and put your pins in, ouch, on the paper side. Pull out the ones that were on the back. So I'm not going to keep showing you the stitching. My next line I'm going to stitch is just this one right here. So starting 1/4 of an inch off, stitch across, ending 1/4 of an inch off. Sorry, I went off the camera. Starting 1/4 of an inch off on this side, stitching straight across, ending 1/4 of an inch off on this side. This time my seam looks pretty good, so I'm not going to bother retrimming it. I wanted to show you something else, and I don't know that there are any in the store. But if you don't want to keep a hot iron nearby, you can use something like this seam roller. A wallpaper roller also works. So I can just roll it, and it creases it pretty well, and then you don't have to use the iron. So that's just another option. Okay, so my next step on this one is going to be adding number 5. So I need to to fold back on the line between 4 and 5. And again, because I went out here, I can just pop those stitches out of the paper out there, fold back, bring my ruler around, put the lip along that fold, and cut. And while I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and cut this other side. You can wait if you want to, but cut. Okay, so now I'm ready to add piece number 5, which is a triangle. And when we start getting into angles, it gets a little bit more tricky. I find that the easiest thing for that kind of triangle would just to be cut a square in half on the diagonal. I think this is still going to be big enough. So what I'm going to do, and you could just use it off the edge, you should have plenty of fabric here to get your pieces. I'm going to put my 45-degree line, and we'll see. I'm going to scoot it over just a little bit to give me a little bit extra here, and cut. And I know I'm cutting backwards. This is not working well. Hang on. Okay. It's a little bit ragged, but let's see if it's going to work. So, I'm going to go right sides together, folded at about 1/4 of an inch. I'm a little bit short on that, so I would probably go ahead and cut a little bit bigger strip for this. This one was 2 inches. Let's cut a 3-inch strip to use for our triangles. I'll just cut 3-inch squares for that matter. Okay. Get that out of the way. 3 inches. I'm just going to, and it doesn't have to be a perfect square because we are trimming up. I'm going to cut it in half. And now I know it's plenty big enough. Put that there. Go right sides together. When I fold it back, it easily covers. So I will just go ahead and pin this, just like I have every other time. And like I said, I like my pins better on this side so I can pull them out, except where I think I missed there. And now this time, I'm going to sew. Which one did I just pin? I just pinned number 6. It's not going to make any difference for this. I should have done 5, but 5 or 6, it doesn't matter one side or the other. You're not going to be able to tell once it's all pieced. I'm going to be sewing along this line because that's where I pinned, starting about 1/4 of an inch beyond where that line starts and ending about 1/4 of an inch out here. I added the other triangle as well without showing you, so I'm ready to trim now. So I'm going to flip this, and don't know what I did. There it is. I'm going to fold now because my next pieces, I have 5 and 6 on. The next one to go on is 7, so it's going to be that line. Fold back, and again pop those stitches out of the paper if they're in the way. And trim, leaving that 1/4 inch seam allowance. And now I'm ready for my next green. And again, it just goes right sides together. It's extending beyond the edge, so I know it's big enough. And I'm just going to sew it on. So I'm going to keep following this process until I get all the way to the top. I'll come back right before I finish the top off. I just want to show you something because this pattern is a little bit different than some paper piecing patterns. See how the line turns into a dotted line out here? I went ahead and sewed all the way out into the seam allowance on these lines because this is running all the way out and I don't want it to be flopping around when I go to sew it together. The other thing I wanted to say while I was here is I need another square to do these little triangles. A 3-inch one would work, but when I look up here at these, I'm not convinced that 3 inches will work. This is how much fabric I have left. So what I'm going to do is, rather than a 3-inch, I'm going to cut a 4-inch strip off of there. I know 4-inch square is plenty big enough. Cut them in squares, cut them in half and triangles to finish this off. I'm ready to add number 17. And remember, I cut a 4-inch square, which is going to be plenty big enough, but I want to show you why it's important to test. If I put it here, or just center it on there, and fold it back, I'm coming up short here on the top. So what I need to do is bump it up this way so I have a lot more hanging off up here and a smaller tail down here on the side. Now if I check it, it's plenty big enough. So that's where the checking before you sew will make a big difference. All of my pieces are stitched onto this block now. And I need to trim it down, but before I trim it down, something I like to do is stitch inside the seam allowance through the paper and through the fabric all the way around. You can see it better on this side where I've done that, and that just holds it in place when I go to trim it. So to trim, a lot of patterns will have what should be a 1/4 inch marked. I think this is a little wide. So rather than following those dotted lines that are supposed to be my 1/4 inch mark, I want to put my 1/4 inch mark on my ruler on that solid line. So this one, that's the outside finished edge of the block. So I'm going to put my ruler on the solid line and trim. And I'm going to do the same thing all the way around. See, this one, I don't even have a 1/4 inch on the solid line on the paper. So again, just the 1/4 inch mark on the solid line, trim on all 4 sides. Trim. And the last side, and trim. Okay, so now my block is actually ready to use. I am going to be doing a spacer piece on here, so we're going to cut this strip down to 9 inches, and I don't remember which side it said to sew onto. I'll have it sewn onto the correct one when I show all the finished blocks. So I'm going to trim it down to 9, the same length, and just sew it with a 1/4 inch seam to whichever side the pattern says. So at this point, I could tear the paper out. My personal preference is to leave the paper in until I have something sewn on all 4 edges of it. So if I look at piece number 16, it actually does have everything sewn around the edges. And the reason I like to do that is sometimes when you're paper piecing, you're just using whatever pieces of fabric you have and putting them on any direction. So you could have a lot of bias around the outside edge. If you were trimming pieces like I showed you today, then you really don't have much bias. But when I get ready to remove the paper, I can come in and score this line either with a nice heavy needle, a pin, the back of a seam ripper, and that'll just make it easier to tear the paper out. So just right over the stitches. I'm just using a pin here because my seam ripper is upstairs. And then I'm just going to get a hold of that paper and tear it out. But like I said, I would leave it until I have something sewn on all the edges, but I just want you to be able to see how to get the paper out. Cutting the background for the tall triangle tree could be a little bit tricky. There's a couple ways you could do this. The first thing I did is I sliced off a 2.5 inch piece off the short end that I can use for my pieces here. Now I could, when I was ready to do this, let's just say my green was already on here, and that was my angle. I could just flip this over and match my long edges, check to make sure that it's going to cover, and then sew it on and cut off this way. That will work. It'll just put bias on the outside edge, which is not a big deal if you stay stitch it. I'm going to try something different. So I've done my pre-folding, and let's see, this piece would go, I need it to be the wrong side, so I got it backwards. Anyway, my right side would be up when it was finished, so that would be sitting on top of here. That would be right. So I went over and I marked a spot. I just chose 3 inches over. And then I'm putting my foundation on top of that. I can actually fold it like this. And I can look and say, okay, there's my 3-inch mark. If I'm lining up my kind of straight edges here, then I'm going to put another mark here. And I'm going to just cut that piece out. And that will kind of give me the angle that I need over on that side. And then for the other side of the tree, I would need a mirror image. So I could just flip this over, right sides together, put my marks, and cut off the other side of the rectangle. So I'll show you how it works when I go to sew it together. I've trimmed one side of my tree. And with this long a tree, you may want to put pins or some glue behind it so that it doesn't shift around while you're working. And that angle that I cut previously by holding my thing up there, my pattern up there with it folded back, the angle is almost perfect. So I'm going to fold it over on that and realize I did cut it bigger because this could go down to a sliver. When I fold it back on the quarter, it covers completely, and that's what I want. Here are my 5 finished pieces for this month. This is 1 month. I don't recommend you wait till the last minute to do this. It can be done in an afternoon, but if you're new to foundation piecing, it could take a little longer. Just a couple hints. On the short pine tree, make sure that before you've cut everything down into strips, you have a big enough piece for the top. And then the spacer strip went onto the right side of the tall pine tree. My motto in foundation piecing is, when in doubt, cut a bigger piece. Just make sure that you don't cut such a big piece that you can't do the other pieces. There is plenty of fabric on all the pieces to finish these. Hopefully you enjoyed foundation piecing. I like it for certain things. The biggest pro for me is that I can get these really sharp points. I can get different shapes as long as they're straight edges easily without templates. The con for me is I feel like it wastes a lot of fabric and I don't enjoy tearing the paper out. So after having said that about the paper, we will be doing foundation piecing again this year. So when we do it that time, I will show you a method where the paper doesn't have to be torn out of the stitches. Anyway, you need to make these 5 blocks. All the trees except for the one that's one fabric. The greens are interchangeable and the browns are interchangeable on all the blocks.